Up in the hills of the San Francisco Bay, amid the towering forest of redwood trees, there is one remaining old-growth tree that is estimated to be more than 500 years old. This tree is called the grandfather tree, or some call it Old Survivor. And it stands out among all the others which sprouted from the stumps of their ancestors that were logged during the gold rush to build the cities of San Francisco and Oakland, because this tree, the grandfather tree, is rooted on a steep and rocky slope that makes it very hard to get to. And it has a twisted and gnarled trunk. Compared to all these other trees around it, Old Survivor is a relatively short tree, only 90 feet tall. And like all these other trees that were logged in the mid-1800s, and the ones that grew from those sprouts that have long, straight trunks ideal for chopping down and making into lumber, this grandfather tree has survived largely by being unsuitable for human consumption. In her book, How to Do Nothing, the author and artist Jenny Odell compares Old Survivor to a tree in a parable from the 4th century in China. This story, called The Useless Tree, is about a carpenter who sees a tree but passes it over as not useful for his purposes. While this tree is old and tall, its gnarled branches make it less than ideal, and so he declares the tree to be worthless. But that night, in a dream, the tree appears to him, and it has a voice. And it points out all the other fruit and timber trees that are regularly ravaged by people. And then the tree asks him, "Are you comparing me to all these useful trees? If I had been of some use, would I ever have grown this large? And what is the point of condemning things anyway? You are a useless man about to die. How do you know that I'm a worthless tree?" Jenny Odell writes that Old Survivor gives her an image of what it looks like to resist in place, to not fit into the mold of what appears to be useful or productive by our society, but to be too weird and too difficult to proceed easily to the sawmill. To resist in place, she says, is to make oneself into a shape that it cannot be so easily appropriated by a capitalist value system. And this is the same argument that Tricia Hersey is making in her manifesto, Rest is Resistance. She writes, "Grind culture has made all of us into human machines, willing and ready to donate our lives to a capitalist system that thrives by placing profits over people. Rest is radical because it disrupts the lie that we are not doing enough. It shouts, 'No, that is a lie. I am enough. I am worthy now and always because I am here.'" We understand resistance as opposing or fighting against, right? To exert our force in opposition to something. And we know, as a peace and justice-loving congregation, that resistance can take many forms. Resistance can be our ability to withstand the effects of something, such as the antibodies that help our bodies to withstand infection and disease. Or sometimes resistance is a matter of our own self-control, not giving in to temptation. But most often we think of resistance as simply the refusal to comply with something, an unjust rule or a law, for example. We envision civil rights protesters sitting down at lunch counters, refusing to be moved from their seats. Striking workers, refusing to go to break the picket line and go back into the mine. Peace activists sitting on the floor of a government building. These are all forms of nonviolent resistance that have been used to force our society to face injustices and to make change. Sometimes resistance looks like stopping, like sitting, like resting. Several of you have pointed out that recently there has been a movement by a young generation of Chinese who balk at the Communist Party's high-minded calls for a continued struggle, alongside a deeply ingrained culture of overwork without promise of any real advancement in that society. This movement they are opting into is called lying flat. And the lying flat movement calls on young workers and professionals, including the middle-class Chinese, who are supposed to be the engine of this country's domestic boom, to opt out of the struggle of workplace success, to reject the promise of consumer fulfillment. The lying flat movement in China resists a severe culture of overtime work that has come to be known as 996. Working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. Lying flat was spawned under the persecution of the 996 overtime culture, someone wrote on social media. We employees are too tired. We have to lie down and rest. And Tricia Hersey writes, we are socialized into systems that cause us to conform and believe that our worth is connected to how much we can produce. Our constant labor becomes a prison that allows us to be disembodied. And then we become easier for the systems to manipulate, disconnected from our power as divine beings. We forget how to dream. And this is how grind culture continues as we internalize the lies and in turn become agents of this unsustainable way of living. I think Jesus knew something about that. Because even in his time and culture, the vast majority of people were subsistence farmers. And their parents and their grandparents had been the same. Most people in first century Palestine worked from sun up to sundown in order to produce just enough food for their family to eat. If a family was wealthy enough to own a bit of land, or perhaps an ox or two, they might be able to produce a bit more that they could then sell to their neighbors. And so many times, if they had an animal, they would use a yoke. Because a yoke was a tool that enabled farmers to increase their productivity, yoking two animals together in order to pull a plow or a cart and to produce more. And throughout the Bible, this symbol of a yoke is a symbol of submission and obedience. Whenever the prophets speak about liberation and justice, they talk about breaking yokes, casting off chains. The prophet Isaiah cries out with the voice of God, "Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke? To set the oppressed free and to break every yoke." And so when Jesus comes along and he sees people that are trapped in systems of oppression, social and economic, but also spiritual, he sees them yoked to all of these things that are not serving them. He sees systems of oppression that are not just external, but are also internal. And he invites them to cast off these yokes and to take on something new, to take on the yoke that Jesus is giving to them. Now we know that to be a follower of Jesus is not necessarily an invitation to a life of ease, but we are making a choice. We are saying yes or no. We are giving up allegiance to the things that are not serving us, and we are aligning ourselves with Jesus, who offers us salvation. Now, salvation may be too spiritual of a word for you, so maybe you could say wholeness, or connection, or abundant life. This is what it means to yoke ourselves with Jesus. This is an invitation that is countercultural. It means that we can depend on God to provide for us. We can rest because our value is not in what we produce, but in our identity as God's children. Imagine what it would feel like, taste like, and smell like if you didn't have to believe who you were was your accomplishments and your labor, writes Tricia Hersey. The culture we live in does not point you toward this deep truth. Instead, it has told you and reinforced the idea that you came into the world to accomplish, to labor, to do, when nothing can be further from the truth. And when we slowly begin to believe and understand our inherent worth is in God, rest becomes possible in many ways. I think this is also when our resistance becomes about more than just taking naps. When it becomes about more than just self-care. This kind of resistance, of claiming our identity, it comes from God. Our value comes from God, that we are entitled to a life of ease and rest. This is resistance. It leads to liberation. It leads to social change and transformation. It leads to collective and communal flourishing. Back at the beginning of that parable about the useless tree, we are introduced to this tree and its gnarled and twisted branches. And the parable says that the branches of the tree were so wide that it could shade several thousand oxen, teams of horses. The shade and shape of this so-called useless tree provides shade and rest to anyone or anything that wants to take shelter there, even the carpenter who deems the tree worthless. Jenny Odell writes that the branches of the tree are in the shape of care, providing ground for life itself. She says, I want to imagine a whole forest of useless trees, branches densely interwoven, providing an impenetrable habitat for birds, snakes, lizards, squirrels, insects, fungi, and lichen. And eventually, through this generous, shaded, and useless environment, might come a weary traveler from the land of usefulness, a carpenter who laid down his tools. And maybe after a bit of days wandering, he might take a cue from the animals and have a seat beneath the tree. And maybe, for the first time ever, he might take a nap. May it be so.